Conversations podcast.
Hello folks, and thanks for tuning in. Today I have a very special guest with me, Associate Professor Mustapha Taibi from Western Sydney University. Now, Mustapha was the Director of Academic Program there for Languages, TESOL, and the Interpreting and Translation Program from the years of 2011 to 2015. In 2014, he was recognized with a citation for outstanding contributions to student learning. His research interests include community interpreting and translation, as well as discourse analysis. On top of all this, he is the leader of the International Community Translation Research Group and the editor-in-chief of Translation Interpreting, which is the International Journal of Translation Interpreting Research. How do you do it all?
Well,
that was such a mouthful there.
I've done it at different stages of my life, so I haven't been doing all this at the same time. Now I'm basically teaching community translation and intercultural communication, and at the same time doing my research basically into community translation and written communication in public services.
Now, I've had a look in your publications, so many. You have 5 books, if I'm not wrong, published?
Books that I have written, 3, I think. The others were edited volumes, which means there were contributions by other authors, and I just had one chapter and coordinated the whole.
Magnificent. And then you have chapters in books as well as countless journal articles. So I'd like to just thank you on behalf of the TNI world for putting all that time and effort in there. Now, you're looking very young, if I don't mind me saying so, and all this experience and years of research and publications. How old are you?
That's confidential.
Oh, let me ask this. How long have you been in this TNI industry?
In academia, I worked in Spain before coming to Australia, and as a lecturer, I've worked for about nearly 20 years now.
Wow, you must have gotten a very early start, or you've got a really good moisturizer. So I don't know which one. All right. Look, we can talk about many things with you, Mustapha, but in particular, I'd like to talk to you about community translation today because you've conducted a lot of research on community translation. You are a practitioner yourself, as well as an educator and a researcher. What is community translation? Let's just start there.
Community translation is translation for the community, or a given community. We can explain it by saying that it's the type of translation that facilitates communication between public services in general, and those members of a given community that don't have a good command or a full command of the dominant language, the mainstream language, or the official language. So here in Australia, for example, we're talking about translating for those enclaves or minority communities where command of English is not at its best. So any kind of public service that needs to communicate with these people, that need to include them in their information strategy or communication strategy, would go through the work of community translators. Community translators are translators who provide a link between administrations, between government departments, between different types of organizations, and the community members out there who don't have a good command of the official language or the administration language, so to speak.
Can you give us an example of some of the texts potentially could be seen under community translation?
Well, here in Australia, actually, we're a leading country in community translation, in the sense that you have a number of departments, health organizations, legal aid, legal organizations, Centrelink, welfare in general, where you have website material available in different languages, leaflets and guides made available in a number of local languages or community languages. That's an example, or these are examples of the work of community translators.
So how does the end user access these translations? I know in Victoria there's healthcare translations. I think there's a website like that. Like, how does, if you're a non-English speaker, you don't speak the language, how do you get to this translation?
Mm-hmm. Well, translations are disseminated in different ways. You can find them on websites. So, for example, any user who is browsing the Centrelink or the Human Services website will find materials, some resources available in different languages. While reading resources available, information available on these websites, they would be directed to material that is specifically available in other languages. At the same time, healthcare translations, for example, would be available on specific websites, and they would also be available in printed format in healthcare centers and hospitals. For example, when you walk into a hospital, most often you would find signs or signs in different languages or instructions in different languages, and you would also find small leaflets about different types of health issues. Now, for example, COVID, diabetes, any kind of health issue of interest where the health authorities or health department or the hospital itself is trying to send out a message to the community out there.
So just like Auslan interpreters have been in the limelight over the last few months because they've been interpreting a lot for the premiers in all the states on a daily basis. I think community translators have also been in the limelight as well, because there's been a lot of information that's been disseminated, right?
Yes, and unfortunately, translators and interpreters in general get attention when things go wrong. So when there can be translator work, community translator work for decades, for years, and all of a sudden, when the media realize that there is an issue with a particular translation or a couple of documents, and this is brought to the light, then people start commenting on it, and you can find the politicians, community leaders, journalists, lay people commenting on the quality of translation. So that's usually the case. But most often the work goes unnoticed. Departments, public services in general, go through translation agencies. Translators do the work gets published online or in print, and some users may make use of the resources. Some others might not even be aware that such resources exist, and life goes on. But as I said, as soon as something negative is identified about a certain translation, then everybody is invited to comment.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to all the community translators out there for doing, I think, such amazing work over the last few months as well. And I guess quality assurance in community translation is another topic of its own, which hopefully we'll get together and talk about in another episode. Look, we said that community translation could be quite challenging. Can you tell us what are some of the main challenges for a translator when they're translating such documents?
Well, one of the challenges is the original text itself, the original text and the kind of language it might use. Well, I should say many, if not most, public services and government organizations do take care when drafting their resources in the sense of making them as clear as possible, avoiding specialized jargon, because in the end, this kind of documents go to lay people who are not specialists in health or in a legal area. So they facilitate the work of translators at the very beginning when they're still drafting the documents. But I must say that there are also other documents or perhaps other organizations who perhaps don't, I would say both organizations and the individual staff who draft the resources or the documents, they might not go through a rigorous process of checking their own texts in terms of how suitable they are for the kind of readership we're aiming at, and also how accessible that information is, that language is, because depending on how accessible that language is or how understandable the language and text are, the work of the translator will be easier or more challenging. As a translator, if I receive a text that is clear, well-structured, coherent, it makes sense, it doesn't have any significant typos or structural or expression error issues, well, I think I will handle it very easily. Now, another challenge which is related to this is the kind of mismatch or asymmetry that normally exists between the writers of the original texts and the intended community or the intended readership. There's usually a huge gap, a significant gap between one and the other. One, I mean, the writer is normally someone who works for a very large organization, someone who has expertise in health, expertise in legal matters, etc., who is a specialist, and they are trying to communicate to they're trying to communicate something to lay people who don't have any background about certain health condition, health procedure, legal issue, etc. So there's already a significant gap between the two, and the translator stands in the middle. So the translator, at the same time, has to be faithful to the original text, try to convey the content, convey the messages as closely as possible, as accurately as possible, but at the same time has the added role or expectation of conveying or managing to convey the message across to a community who may come from different backgrounds with different literacy levels and so on. So that's an additional challenge for the translator. And depending on the kind of role the translator himself or herself assumes, they might tend towards keeping the original as it is, even if it's complex, if it is too difficult to understand, or they might orient their translation more towards the reader and make it as digestible as possible.
So in your opinion, should the translator be more source text focused or target text focused?
Definitely, community translation is about being target reader focused. You can't. Here we're not talking about legal documents. We're not talking about institutional documents that are translated, let's say, between internationally between equivalent institutions. We're not talking about United Nations documents. We're not talking about institutional documents that need to be translated, for example, to be sent to another ministry outside Australia, internationally, etc. We're talking about basic information, generally general information that is aimed at lay people who don't have practically any background about a specific issue. So the main job of the interpreter here is to make the translator here is to make the translation as accessible as possible. We need to take into consideration who the audience, the expected audience is, where the majority of these readers come from, what is their average literacy level, what kind of language and language variety they speak or they're able to read. All these considerations need to be taken into account when drafting your translation, because here it's not only about accuracy, but also it's also a question of communication strategy. Because when an institution, when a public service, when a government agency sends out a message, whether it's related to COVID, whether it's related to recycling, for example, whether it's related to crime or to a health condition, the main focus and the main aim is for people to become aware of the issue, is for people to understand what's going on, understand what's required, and act upon the instructions or the information. It's not just information for information's sake, but information in order to educate and in order to raise awareness, and therefore expect people to do something about it. And of course, if you want readers to do something about a message, they need to understand it first, and the message needs to come in a language, in a format, in a package that's appealing to them. Well, we normally follow messages or act upon messages or receive messages favorably when they appeal to us. When they appeal to us in terms of aesthetics, in terms of content, in terms of structure, in terms of how compatible they are or how relevant they are to our own lives, to our own background. And that's why I'm saying that the role of the translator there is essential, not only as someone who conveys the ideas, but also someone who conveys them in an appropriate manner, appropriate for the target readership.
There's a massive burden on the translator's shoulders then, isn't there? I mean,
yes, of course.
You're saying that, look, and I'm not going to blame all the, I guess, government institutions, but, you know, I did some translations for NDIS, and the language itself was so complicated, and then you need to almost simplify that. And the NDIS is a concept that doesn't exist in my load country, you know, so you're translating something that doesn't exist, which already has some very, very complex language. And like you said, you need to make it so that after reading the first couple of paragraphs, people are going to keep reading it, or they're going to go, I don't understand what this is about, and just throw it away, you know. So, I mean, why there's a lot of pressure put on the translator. In your opinion, I mean, the source text writers, could they not write things in a more simpler way? It's not even just for the sake of the translator, I guess for the sake of every layperson out there that's reading this.
Yeah, well, even in English, there has been, excuse me, even in English, there has been a very well-known movement called Plain English movement, which advocates for institutional documents or texts to be written in simple English, in accessible language to an average reader. And the same applies to texts that are intended for translation in the future. Here, just like we speak of translator training, we also need to have appropriate and adequate training for those staff who draft official official documents or resources for public services in general.
I mean, especially in a country like Australia, it's so multicultural, so many different languages spoken. When these texts are originally produced in English, I mean, you'd think that they would write it in a way that, and they would know that this information would be translated, right? So, you know, when they're being commissioned to say, okay, we need you to write an informative text about this, I wonder if they're also being told, by the way, this will be translated into 150 languages. Please keep that in mind. I wonder if they're even being told that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess in sometimes that happens, some other times it doesn't.
Yeah, and I think it would be more obvious. The ones that happens would be a lot more easier to translate, I guess. Yeah, we'll talk about quality assurance in our next episode. Now, when we were talking about these challenges, I think we mentioned some of the cultural challenges as well. What are some of the cultural challenges that the translator will be faced with? I mean, I know that your Lot is Arabic, right? But you also studied in Spain. So you have two countries, two languages here that are spoken in 20 plus countries. I mean, how does a translator that has to deal with so many different cultures as well deal with these issues?
Well, I think there are two main issues there, not only culture, but also in terms of language. In terms of language, there might be language asymmetry between English and the target language, in the sense that, as you mentioned earlier, not all languages have equivalent concepts or names for different processes, because languages develop differently and at different paces, depending on the developments taking place in the societies where those languages are spoken. So English, of course, has taken a course. Arabic is taking a different course. Spanish is developing along the societal, economic, and political developments taking place in Spanish-speaking countries. And in many cases, well, not in the case of, let's say, widely spoken languages like Spanish or French. It's often the case for some minority languages where administrative terminology, for example, is not very well developed. Scientific language or terminology is not very well developed. And in that case, the translator may well understand the original text in English, may have a good understanding of the terminology in English, but does not necessarily have equivalent terms in the target language. And in this case, the translator might find himself or herself in a situation where they need to rephrase or explain the concept rather than choose an equivalent. So here we have a case of language asymmetry. We don't have equivalent terms and structures in different languages. The other challenge is cultural, because every language group has its own cultural background, and sometimes within the same language group, that is, say, the same language community, we have a number of different cultural backgrounds, as is the case in Spanish. Well, Spanish is spoken in Spain, and it's also spoken in a large part of South America. And of course, each speaker and each small community would come from a particular cultural background with differences, of course. Things we speak about here in Australia and the way we speak about them, the way we express them, the cultural concepts and associations we have here in Australia do not necessarily translate in a mechanical way when we're writing in Arabic, Persian, or Chinese, or any other language, because each language has its own cultural background or baggage. And here the translator, of course, needs to make sure that it's not only the language or the expression that is transferred across languages, but also the cultural concept, whether it's to what extent it's possible to convey it, to what extent it is possible to adapt it, to what extent it is relevant and appropriate for the target readership. Well, when we write about anything here, about health, about legal matters, about welfare, about administration, etc., when you read texts in these areas, you will definitely come across some culture-specific terms, terms that are specific to Australia, to the local reality. And even in Britain or in the United States, countries where English is spoken, people might not be able to understand. And this is the kind of challenge or additional challenge that community translators are faced with. But in many cases, the good news is that translations are for migrants and refugees who are already living in the country, and especially for those who have been living in Australia for some time. They would have learned something about the Australian culture. They would have acquired some general knowledge about the country, etc., which makes communication at this level a bit, I would say, a bit easier, because they would also share some sort of cultural background, even if it's at a very basic level.
Well, what are some of the strategies a translator can employ when they're faced with such cultural challenges?
Well, I suggest that the translator, as always, needs to start by looking at the overall aim of the text, nature of the text, and then look at the specific culture-specific item and what its role in the text is. Sometimes it's just an example. If it's just an example without a significant role in that text, well, you can definitely replace it with another example from a different culture. Like, for example, there was an ad some time ago about something like shrimps on a Barbie.
Shrimps on the Barbie, yeah.
Yes, and well, that's very Australian, and it was translated into Arabic, and I was able to hear it on the radio, community radio, and it was a literal translation of that message. Well, obviously the message was about road safety, not speeding. So the main message there is to ask people, whoever they are, not to speed, to place safety first. Okay, so the example of Barbie there, or shrimps, or any other thing, is just an example. You can perfectly replace it with something similar that relates to your daily activity and the daily language you use. Arabic speakers or Spanish speakers use. You don't have to reproduce exactly the same example, because
chuck another kebab on the Barbie, for example.
Yes, anything that would work in that context. That's why I said we need to look at the function and aim of the text in general, and then look at those specific culture-specific items or expressions, and analyze the role of those terms or cultural references. If they're essential, well, there are different strategies. Sometimes we can try to find something similar, or something that looks or that would function as an equivalent in the target language and culture. Sometimes we can rephrase and explain. Sometimes we can, as I said before, we can replace completely with something new and something that's relevant, and relevant to the text, of course, and also relevant to the community who's going to read the text.
Well, That sounds like very good advice. Now, how is the training provided in community translation? I mean, we know that, you know, most universities offer a translation program. Some TAFE courses also offer translation programs. But I'm not quite sure if all the languages that are out there are offered, you know, especially with the new and emerging and rare languages. I wonder if they'd be able to get access to this kind of training. What do you think the industry is at the moment in regards to providing training for community translation?
Well, first of all, I would say that any formal training in translation, even if it's generalist, that it say doesn't focus on community translation in particular, would be adequate for future professional translators who intend to work in community translation and in other areas of translation. If someone does a BA in translation and interpreting, a master in interpreting and translation, a graduate diploma in translation, most probably, well, of course, if they meet the criteria and they do well in their program, most probably they will be qualified to deal with generalist texts, including community translation texts, because here, as I said before, we're not talking about specialized language or specialized texts. They're generally texts that are relatively easy to understand and relatively easy to translate. Having said that, I don't know of any universities that specifically cater for community translation. At our university, we have a unit or a subject called community translation. That's part of the BA in interpreting and translation, and also part of postgraduate courses in interpreting and translation. At some other universities, there might be a very small component on public service translation or community translation, but most cater for translation in general, including specialized translation, literary translation, audiovisual translation, and different fields. And that's understandable because universities and training institutions need to cater for as many areas of translation and interpreting as possible. The problem here is that not all languages have, or language groups have available to them this kind of translation training, and the same applies to interpreting. Here in Australia, very few languages are covered by university and TAFE courses, which means that a large number of languages are not covered. A large number of languages, translators don't have access to sufficient training opportunities.
Why do you think that is?
The main reason has to do with the logistics of course offering and the viability of courses. Universities, and I understand TAFE as well, are guided by the viability of their programs. So obviously they can't launch or offer a large number of interpreting and translation programs that include a large number of languages without the guarantee that there will be a sufficient number of enrollments in each language combination. That's understandable. At our university, for example, we have added languages, deleted languages, depending on demand. And we know that because of the community size or the population size of certain communities, we just don't have enough people to take courses in certain languages.
Supply and demand, basically, at the moment.
Yes, that's why universities and TAFE have historically provided for certain languages and not for others.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess for those languages that don't have access to formal training, they've got to keep an eye on continuous professional development and make sure they follow up with webinars and short courses and things like that as best as they can, right?
Yes, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Hopefully next time we meet, we're going to be talking about quality assurance in community translation. And today I had Associate Professor Mustapha Taibi from Western Sydney University. So thank you very much for your time today, Mustapha.
Thank you, Fatih. It's been nice talking to you, and I look forward to the next session.
Definitely. Sounds great. Have a good one.
All Graduates Conversations Podcast.